Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and this tutorial is called the Digital Collage. So this is a talk adapted from something I teach students. Seasoned professionals already know this stuff, but I found that it's not immediately obvious to people who are just starting out. So when someone said I made a painting in the traditional era, it was pretty obvious what they had done. They had paper or canvas, used paint, and moved a paintbrush in their hand to arrive at the final image. Even in the early digital era, I made a painting had many of the same features. The canvas was replaced with a screen and tablet, the paintbrush was a pen-shaped peripheral, and the paint were now pixels. But fundamentally, it still involved choosing color and moving a paintbrush-shaped object to arrive at the final result. But now, especially in the concept art field, making a painting may not be what you expect. A painting frequently consists of many elements put together, some digital painting, some photo bashing, and even some 3D, all mixed together. In my opinion, it would have been better to have called this a digital collage than a painting, but it's too late to change the term now. Regardless of what you call it, understanding it as more of a collage may let you solidify in your own mind the process and which technique to use for what to achieve the best results. So first, a little background. The first time I ran into the digital collage was in 1997 with the artwork of Dave McKean, a famous artist who did covers for Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, as well as album covers and his own books. His collage involved taking photographs of things, then bringing them into the computer and assembling them and painting on top of them digitally to achieve the final piece. I loved his work and wanted to try something similar. However, at the time, digital photography was still very much in its infancy, and I didn't have a good traditional camera. But I was experimenting with 3D graphics using programs such as Pavre and 3D Studio, and so I thought, well, what if instead of photos in Photoshop Paint, I tried mixing 3D in Photoshop Paint? One of the things I didn't like about 3D was how all the lines were too perfect, so mixing mediums struck me as a way to dirty up my 3D, giving it a more organic feel. Here are some examples of my process. The image on the left is my 3D render from 3D Studio, and then I made layers and overlays of mist and dirt, adding glows and flares, all in 2D to get the final result. Here's another example, using 3D as a base, and then adding elements in 2D to achieve something that was far too time-consuming to get in 3D exclusively. It was at about this point that there started being a lot of articles about modern-day matte painting and visual effects films. While traditional matte painting involved painting on glass with a paintbrush, in the Lord of the Rings films, you'd get photographs of miniatures and combine them with bits and pieces of photos of other elements and paint on top in Photoshop to get your final film frame. Shortly afterwards, I started seeing people combining 3D renders with the photos and hand painting, for example this Gnomon video by Chris Stosky. At the same time, digital cameras were getting cheaper and easier to use, and so the barrier on taking photographs became a non-issue, and so I joined in adding photos to my collages to create my work. Here's an early example of the process. The first image is the 3D elements I made in 3D Studio for this creature. Then I collected and scanned photos of roots, and then mixed them in with the 3D, adding tiny details that would have been too time-consuming to add with 3D modeling. And then here's the final image, which includes some hand paint in Photoshop. Here's another example from my book on megastructures. This one is the Skyhook. So the first thing I needed was a planet Earth. One thing I got into the habit of doing when flying is taking photos of clouds through the window. So to make the planet, I started with the glow painted in Photoshop. Then I added the planet itself. Then I took one of my airplane photos of clouds and layered it in, and then mixed it with another photo of clouds, color corrected to match the first photo. Then more photos layered in, and more, and more. And this process, by the way, is photo bashing, which means taking many photos and mixing them together digitally to get something new. So after this part was done, I created the spaceship in 3D and added textures. However, you'll note that the texture is a little bit odd in places. Now, while I could fix this by painting very specific texture maps, I knew the final piece was going to be a still image, not an animation, so it was faster to hand paint in Photoshop a few elements that you can see here, fixing up the texture errors on the craft. And again, here's the final image. Some more examples. This painting is also a mix. We start with 3D. The little trees are these very simple spheres with noise on them. And then for the landscape, I took satellite images and painted on top of it some sci-fi road networks. Then placed this texture map on the ground in 3D. I did it this way because getting the proper curvature on the ground would have been a real pain to do in 2D, but as a 2D element mapped onto a 3D surface, it was really simple. Then the details on the buildings were painted in 2D, and then more 2D painting, and then the final color correction, glows, and even a little bit of lens distortion. Another couple of quick examples. These two spaceships started as simple 3D geometry, which I used as perspective reference, and then added hand paint and photographs to get the final result. This robot is the same, simple 3D, and then I painted on top in 2D. And one last painting from Megastructures. The sky is a combination of hand paint and cloud photos, the buildings are photographs that have been manipulated, and the closer spaceship is 3D. So you may ask, why a digital collage instead of just painting it all by hand? The answer is speed. Different techniques are better at different things. For example, while I can draw in perspective, setting up complex perspective and architecture can take a long time to set up. But if you use 3D, you basically get the perspective for free. And if you want, say, a tree, you could hand paint it, but it's far faster to take a photo of a tree and manipulate it than painting a tree from scratch. But then hand painting small details is far faster than building them in 3D, and more flexible than trying to find a photo of something specific, especially if it's fantasy or sci-fi. So the goal is to use the technique for what it's best at, trying to achieve the best of all worlds and mix the results together. And one final note, I've been asked a lot in the past, is this technique cheating? Well, you can't answer that without first asking, what is your objective? If your goal is to show how well you paint trees, and you use a tree photograph, then yes, you're absolutely cheating. But if your goal is to create a concept for, say, a film, and your idea involves a tree, then there's nothing wrong with incorporating a tree photo or elements of tree photos, because your goal isn't to impress people with your mad painting skills. The goal is to communicate an idea. As long as you don't misrepresent your technique, I see nothing wrong with adding photos in 3D, especially when you take your own photographs instead of taking random stuff from the internet, and especially if you make your own 3D models. There's still plenty of yourself in the final design that you can be proud of the results. So next time you see a digital painting, keep in mind the techniques that may be behind its execution, and try them out in your own work and see what works best for you. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this interesting. If you want to see more videos like this and other written tutorials, please go to neilblevins.com and go to the Art Lessons section. Or if you want to be notified the next time I post a new video, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.